2 minutes. So again, we're going to start in just in 1 minute now. Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to Balance, Getting to Carbon Neutrality Through Carbon Sequestration and Offsets. This is the 4th session of a 5-part webinar series running through next Wednesday, May 18th. I'm Andy Mutziger, Planning Manager at the San Luis Obispo County Air Pollution Control District, and I will be your host. Today's session is the last of our speakers sessions, and it's entitled Beyond Carbon Markets, Holistic and Integrated Projects and Stewardship. Thanks for joining our educational series. Before we get started, I'll cover some housekeeping rules. This webinar is being recorded. Please remain muted unless you are speaking. If you're experiencing buffering problems, we recommend that you turn off your camera if you're on camera. Please hold your questions to the end of each speaker's presentation. You can type those into the chat, or you can raise your hand as well. We may have some additional time at the end for additional questions, and the webinar team is providing an accompanying Q&A document that will be posted on the resources page of the webinar series website. So we can get to our speakers. I want to quickly review the purpose of our webinar. In 2022, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, their 6th assessment report urged the time for action is now and identified rapid pathways to cut global emissions by 50% this decade. In California, the Air Resources Board is working on a 2023 scoping plan update with strategies to balance emissions and carbon sinks by 2045. One thing is clear, achieving carbon neutrality will ultimately require emission reductions that we cannot mitigate or minimize otherwise. Whether this is at the scale of individual projects, entire organizations, or communities, carbon offsets will and sequestration projects that we're going to be talking about today will increasingly become part of our climate action toolkit. Our previous 3 sessions addressed the light gray questions in this slide. Today's session will cover how we can support local sequestration projects that provide good carbon benefits, but which may or may not meet protocol rigors to qualify for offsets. Your webinar team includes local governments, air pollution control districts, and nonprofits seeking ways to initiate and expand local sequestration projects so we can meet local, regional, and global carbon goals. We are not experts, but over the last 2 years, we have researched and built our knowledge. This webinar series, what we're trying to do is we're seeking to inform the larger community. And I'll just pause for a moment here to recognize the webinar series organizers. We hope this series will increase your awareness and interest in the possibilities of facilitating local carbon sequestration and offset projects as a way to improve land management and stimulate economic development. We want to thank our two event hosts, the Central Coast Climate Collaborative and the Santa Barbara County Regional Climate Collaborative. Both collaborators are growing networks for public agencies, nonprofits, businesses, and community-based organizations seeking to collaborate in addressing our region's climate challenges. We invite you to visit their webpage and learn about each of the collaborations and find ways to engage. While this series is a bit of a Central Coast flair, we recognize that it has universal applicability of its content. Session 1, which you can get to from the recordings on the website, covered the basics and advanced inner workings of carbon markets or offset markets. Session 2 went deeper into the protocols, market actors, and considerations of the supply side of carbon markets. Session 3 explored the demand side considerations of the markets through perspectives of local governments, university, and project development for consultants. Session 4 today will go into carbon markets to explore ways in which land stewardships are already caring for the land through regenerative practices and how non-market projects or programs can support them. Next Wednesday, session 5 is our final session, and it's designed to be an interactive discussion, offering an opportunity for series participants to go into breakout rooms to collaborate on how various local carbon sequestration and offset projects could be developed, funded, and implemented. We'll come out of those breakout rooms with project representatives giving a debrief to the larger group on their key takeaways. That interactive session does require separate registration. The YouTube recordings, the sessions, the speaker bios, presentations, summaries of the questions and answers, and other resources are available on the webpage for this session, for the webinar series. While this series focuses on carbon offsets and carbon sequestration projects, we recognize that they are not the only solution to meeting carbon neutrality or supporting land stewardship, and nor should they be. This series is not an endorsement of any particular solution, approach, or company. It is meant to be a compilation of practitioners who will share their experience and perspectives on this complex topic. So today, our session is Beyond Carbon Markets, the Holistic and Integrated Projects and Stewardship. Sydney with the Nature Conservancy will describe 13 nature-based solutions they have identified that can be implemented today in California. Devin and Michael with Upper Salinas-Las Tablas Resource Conservation District and cBrain respectively will describe their sustainable land initiative to identify RCD landowners who will commit to implementing carbon sequestration practices when there's available funding. And finally, Jordan with Tablas Creek Vineyard will describe the carbon sequestration and other benefits that they are realizing with their regenerative agriculture and biodynamic practices they've been pioneering here on the Central Coast. And with that, we'll move over to Sydney Chamberlin. She's a project manager with the Nature Conservancy. Take it away, Sydney. I'll go ahead and start your presentation.
Thanks, Andy. Hi, everyone. Hope you can all hear me okay, and just holler if you can't. So as Andy said, I'm with the Nature Conservancy. I'm a project manager for climate and nature-based solutions. And today we're talking about land, we're talking about nature. And so I just want to start by saying I'm calling in from Sacramento. And this is an area with land that's got a history rich in culture, heritage, and tradition. And I just want to acknowledge that the Nisenan people, who are the original inhabitants of these lands and who stewarded and called them homes for thousands of years. So I just wanted to jump in with that. So let's get started. If you haven't heard of the Nature Conservancy, we're a global environmental nonprofit working to conserve the lands and waters on which all life depends. And as you can imagine, climate change is a huge threat to our mission. So we've been working hard to develop robust, durable, science-based solutions that can ensure people and nature can thrive together on a warmer planet. And of course, nature is key to this work. Can you just go back a slide? Sorry, Andy. So California needs its natural and working land sector if it's going to achieve carbon neutrality or reach its other climate goals. But there's really more to the story here than just greenhouse gas mitigation. And I really appreciate, Andy, the slide you had a minute ago where you're saying carbon offsets aren't the whole picture, because really there's more to nature-based solutions and the way we think about stewarding our lands than just greenhouse gas mitigation. One of the really great things about land stewardship and nature-based solutions is that they come with multiple co-benefits. And that includes adaptation co-benefits that increase our resilience against the impacts of climate change that we can avoid, as well as additional co-benefits, things like cleaner air and water, recreational space for people, and more. And so when we step back and think not just about greenhouse gas mitigation, but also these other co-benefits, we have an opportunity to think about how we can achieve multiple goals with these solutions, goals that can help make our communities healthier. And so, this is webinar 4 in the series. And if you've been coming in, you've been hearing a lot about carbon markets so far. But what I want to do here is just step back a little bit, recognizing that carbon markets are an important, but just one driver for nature-based solutions, and talk about some of the work that TNC has done around nature-based solutions in California. Next slide. Oh, I think we skipped one, but that's okay. We're a science-based organization, and over the last decade, our team has thought a lot about the intersection of nature and climate change in California. And some of the questions that we've worked to tackle include, for example, trying to understand what the main drivers are for carbon sequestration changes on landscapes, understanding what land management or restoration activities can lead to greenhouse gas reductions, where these solutions can be implemented, and what the cost of it all is. And so there's a growing and large body of literature on this topic, including some of the papers that I've highlighted on this slide, but there's a lot there. And so in 2020, we realized that it might be helpful to take some of these results and put them together and address 2 different questions for California. First, the question is, where is there opportunity to implement these solutions in the state? And what is the scale of associated reduction potential with that? And then the second question is, well, with all that in mind, how do you actually get there? How do you actually implement these solutions at scale? And what kind of policy changes or other levers do we need to use to make that happen? Okay, now we'll go to the next slide. And so we started to work on a report exploring 13 different nature-based solutions. And 13 is not like the list of all nature-based solutions. This is just a finite number of possible different solutions, but it is a broad suite of solutions that looks at most types of lands along the state outside of deserts. And so, the way we think about this is that with nature-based solutions, the idea is first to try to conserve intact landscapes where we can, and then restore and manage those landscapes that have been degraded or converted to other uses when we can't conserve lands. And so avoided conversion is itself a solution that we considered as part of this suite, but we also looked at other solutions that cut across multiple land types. So several different solutions involving forests, including different management and restoration actions. We looked at a number of solutions for ag and working lands, and we also considered urban lands, so thinking about urban forestry. Next slide. And again, the first part of this work was to help us understand the scale of the opportunity in California, where this suite of solutions could be implemented, and what kind of greenhouse gas benefits are associated with them. We don't have a lot of time. If we did, I could show you some really, really pretty maps, and maybe you'll have time in the questions. But I did want to show you this great summary map on this page here. So what you're looking at on this map is where there's opportunity to implement one of these 13 nature-based climate solutions in California. And each color represents a different nature-based solution on this map. And I didn't put the legend on there, but you can just imagine different solutions, different colors on the map. And actually the pixels on this map can overlap. So even when you just see one color, there could be a pixel covering others. And what that means is that in some cases, multiple nature-based climate solutions are possible on a single parcel of land. When you tally up the greenhouse gas reduction potential associated with these solutions, you get some numbers. So the first number is just how much land there is. More than 28 million acres of land suitable for these solutions in California. And then the second number is like, what's the potential? And that number is 514 million metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent cumulatively by the year 2050. And that's a material number. Andy, if you bump to the next slide, I wanted to try to contextualize that number a little bit better because sometimes numbers are just really abstract. And so if we think about this in terms that a lot of us are familiar with, like the transportation sector, this number, 500 million metric tons, is about the same as reducing all of California's 2019 transportation emissions 3 times. So that's a lot. Next slide. But as we said earlier, one of the really great features of these solutions is that they're not just about mitigation potential. And we wanted to think about that, to think about the co-benefits that come with these solutions. And so in this report, we also looked at several different co-benefits. And again, not an exhaustive list of co-benefits, but these 7 icons you see on this slide show you the kind of co-benefits we were thinking about when we were doing this report. So we looked at, for example, where is agricultural land benefiting from these solutions? We looked at habitat connectivity, recreation and open space for people, increasing groundwater recharge, high quality species habitat, increasing habitat resilience against climate change, and we looked at flood risk reduction. And the map that you see on this page, kind of helpful to think about overlaying that on the map on the previous slide. So thinking, well, if we were to implement these nature-based solutions in California, this map is showing you how many co-benefits you get with doing that. And the darker the color, the more co-benefits. And so what you can see is that in most cases, when you implement these solutions, you're not getting just one, but multiple co-benefits. Next slide. We also wanted to explore in this report whether there's opportunity to implement these solutions in regions where the state has identified priority populations in addressing climate change. And there are multiple ways to think about how we can define frontline communities. But if you consider California's Coronavirus screen criteria and you look at low income and disadvantaged communities, which are shown on the map here on this slide, you can see that these regions overlap a lot with the places we saw on the last slide. So they overlap a lot in the places where there's opportunity for nature-based solutions. And importantly, this means that these co-benefits can also be applied in these regions. There's a lot more work we need to do to dig into this. This is like step 0 of thinking about this. But the bottom line is that the many complementary benefits you get from these solutions could carry significant beneficial impacts for these communities who we know are disproportionately and often the first to be negatively impacted by climate change. Next slide. Okay, so I gave you a lightning tour of the first part of this report, and there's much more, by the way. We have a great story map we developed to go with this, and I know I just showed you one map with lots of different colored pixels, but we actually have maps separately for each separate climate solution. So I have 13 really pretty maps in the report that can show more detail. But ultimately, the first part of that was, where is there opportunity to do this and what's the scale of the potential? And that was just like the lightning version, right? But another big objective for us in doing this work was also to think about, how do we get there and what is it going to take to get there? And so we wanted to think about the different policy pathways that we could use to accelerate these solutions. And so what we did in order to explore that and sort of get a little bit more policy context was to divide the state into the 7 regions you see on this map. So there's sort of different regions scattered across the state. And within each of those regions, we tried to find instances where nature-based climate solutions have been implemented and basically ask the questions, well, what kind of conditions enabled those solutions to be successful and how might they be replicated elsewhere? And so I know we don't have a lot of time, but this was a really helpful approach for us, because looking at these case studies, getting a sense of like where there were barriers or where something was successful, it gave us a way to really develop a number of concrete policy recommendations that can be used to help scale nature-based solutions. So I just wanted to flag briefly the Central Coast examples here. And this is the region that's circled in green here. And both of the case studies that we looked at for the Central Coast, they happen to involve wetland conservation, but I just want to emphasize there's plenty of potential for other types of nature-based solutions in this region too. So if we go to the next slide, the photo you're looking at here is something called Hester Marsh. And this is a marsh that's undergoing restoration work, producing climate benefits and co-benefits like flood risk reduction. So this project is being led by the Tidal Wetland Program at the Elkhorn Slough National Estuarine Research Reserve. It includes the restoration of 120 acres of tidal marsh in the Elkhorn Slough of Monterey Bay. And Elkhorn Slough is one of California's largest estuaries. It's the largest salt marsh south of the San Francisco Bay. And it's also a really important habitat for migratory birds, invertebrates, fish, marine mammals, a whole bunch of wildlife. And the slough itself is surrounded by development and productive agricultural land. What's neat about this example is that it really showcases how we can have truly integrated multi-benefit solutions for the area. So in addition to greenhouse gas benefits, this project will increase the extent of tidal marsh, which protects against climate impacts like sea level rise and flooding, and it improves surface water quality and sea otter habitat. It's really tempted to put a sea otter photo on the slide, but I held off. The Elkhorn Slough and its restoration have been funded through a variety of sources that include state, federal, and private funding. About half of the funding for this project is coming from GGRF money, or Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund money, through the California Department of Fish and Wildlife's Wetland Restoration for Greenhouse Gas Reduction Program. But there's additional funding, including from US Fish and Wildlife, the Department of Water Resources, the State Coastal Conservancy, Wildlife Conservation Board, and the Ocean Protection Council. So a variety of state and federal sources there. And what's neat is that there's potential for more wetland restoration like this across the region. There's something like 158,000 acres of land available for wetland restoration like this just in the Central Coast alone, and nearly 1.9 acres of coastal and inland wetlands across the state. That's a lot of land. But to restore wetlands more quickly and to scale up the efforts to really meet the pace and the scale of climate change, we really need to do more. And part of that involves developing partnerships to help support funding and support the work. One thing that was really interesting that we learned from this case study is that in this particular case, it took more than 3 years to secure the permits needed to do the work. And when you're talking about, at least in my space, and I think for all of you on this call, we often are hearing about how we're in the critical decade for action on climate change. So when you have a situation where it takes years just to get the permits in place, to get a shovel to the ground, that's problematic. And so we learned a lot about, some of the barriers that we face for this kind of work. And Andy, if you just hit next, come up with a couple of policy recommendations to flag for this. And there's much more in our report, but some of the things that jumped out at us from looking at this case study are the need to, for example, streamline or think about how we improve our permitting processes and government coordination, just to make that so it's not taking 3 or 4 years for people to get permits in place. And then the other things we identified, we're thinking about facilitating new markets and incentives for this kind of work. So for example, having a wetland restoration protocol for cap and trade, a compliance protocol, and then thinking about how to elevate and fund this kind of restoration in states' pre-disaster mitigation efforts. So those are a couple of the things that jumped out of this case study. And then if we go to the next slide. So this is another case study that we looked at for the Central Coast, again, wetland restoration. This involves one called the Dotson Family Marsh. And this is a 238-acre regional wetland that's located on the San Pablo Bay in Richmond. It was acquired by East Bay Regional Parks in 2009. And what they're doing there is restoring 60 acres of wetland and 90 acres of coastal prairie. And what I really like about this example is that it showcases how one project can include multiple benefits or involve multiple benefits, and how funding can actually reflect that. So this area is something designated as a priority conservation area. And these are regionally significant open space areas that are facing development pressure. And these priority conservation areas are designated for preservation through a local government consensus in the Bay Area. And what's happened with the work at Dotson Family Marsh, first of all, the restoration work is doing this great stuff. It's avoiding carbon dioxide emissions that are associated with land conversion. It's helping sequester more carbon from the atmosphere through additional restoration work. And it's also going to help mitigate future damage from rising sea levels and from flooding. But what's cool about this is the funding that was used to help, or some of the funding that was used to help secure this project. So the work is being funded by a number of sources, but what's unique about one of these sources is that some of the work was funded through a program overseen by a regional transportation agency. So there's a program called the One Bay Area Grant Program, or OBAG program. It's a program that wasn't designed with climate mitigation in mind, but ultimately it's a program that was able to fund this work. So it's actually sort of transportation related. And in the first round of grants for this, the transportation funds had to be spent primarily on trails and public access. And so the Coastal Conservancy provided bond money from Prop 40 to help pay for conservation and restoration efforts. But in the second round, they're able to create more flexible funding by exchanging transportation funds for local funds that could be granted directly for land conservation, restoration, and fee acquisition. And so really what this example shows is that when we look at this big picture view of nature-based solutions about the kind of benefits we're getting and the co-benefits that come with them, there's really opportunity to connect what we're doing to other sectors and think, when we connect to these other sectors, that opens up doors to think about innovative funding levers to really help catalyze action. And if you just hit next, there's a couple of recommendations for this, related to this example. So one is like enabling regional transportation agencies to replicate this kind of work. But I think a big one is the second point, facilitating greater use and coordination of transportation funds to support land conservation and restoration. That's something we've thought about a lot, not even just in the context of wetlands, but California has set ambitious goals to reduce vehicle miles traveled as part of its climate goals. And so when we help to link or connect the dots between those transportation goals and our land conservation and our land management goals, we can kind of do both things at once. And sometimes there are real opportunities to connect to funding sources that might not otherwise be available. So kind of a neat example and a neat way to think. Maybe, I guess, I hope what you would take away from these two examples is that with nature-based solutions, as you have these multiple co-benefits, there's really an opportunity to think outside the box about how you want to achieve the goal and what kind of resources are available to help you get there. Okay, so next, this is just a plug for our story map. And I think someone asked in the chat if we have a link to our report, which I'm happy to also pop in the chat after I stop talking. The report itself is kind of long, but of course I'm biased because I worked on it. I think it's really cool. But we also developed the story map, and there's a screenshot of the story map on the left-hand side of the slide here. And in the story map, you can kind of walk through, you can see all the results visually. You can actually click through, there's an interactive part where you can explore your region of the state. So I'd really encourage folks to take a look if you have a chance. Great opportunity to explore the work. And I know, again, we don't have a ton of time, and I wanted to leave plenty of time for questions, but I did want to wrap up with another example. So next slide. And this is not something that is highlighted in the report that I just talked about, but it is something that we're doing on the ground here in California. And so I just wanted to share it, talk about it a little bit as another example of the way that we can implement these projects that carry these robust benefits for communities and for people and nature. So this is a project called Staten Islands, and not to be confused with New York. For those of you who aren't from California, this is a piece of property located in the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta. And it's a really interesting region. It's a really important region. There's a lot of agriculture in the region. There's rich biodiversity in this region. A lot of birds pass through here. So it's a pretty important stop on the Pacific Flyway. So for a lot of migratory birds. And there's a lot of infrastructure in this area. There's energy infrastructure, there's transportation infrastructure, and really critically, there's water infrastructure. And in fact, more than 2/3 of Californians get clean, fresh water supplies through the Delta. So it's really a vital piece of California's water supplies. Next slide. What we're doing in the Delta, this piece of property, Staten Island, was acquired by the Nature Conservancy about 20 years ago. And the goal was to create a wildlife-friendly ag project that also could produce other benefits. And over the years, as we've done the work out there, we've started to realize that not only is it about wildlife, but that there are climate benefits associated with this work too. And so right now we're in the process of developing this work as an offset project for California's voluntary market. And it's a really interesting project. So it's what we call a mosaic agricultural project. And the word mosaic is used because what we're doing here is we're pairing agricultural work with wetland restoration, so side by side. And collectively what we're doing is we're converting 4,000 acres of corn crops to rice, and then additionally restoring 1,000 acres of wetland. And so altogether there are 5,000 acres that define this project, and it's going to be on the voluntary market. And then if we hit next slide. There are great carbon benefits that are coming with this project. So we're using American Carbon Registry protocol. It's called Restoration of California Deltaic and Coastal Wetlands. I think it's a pretty new protocol. I think if memory serves, this protocol was developed in about 2017. So it's relatively new. And the estimates we have right now are that cumulatively by 2050, we'll be able to reduce about 350,000 metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent on the site doing this work. But again, this whole talk, it's not just about the carbon benefits, right? There are also other important benefits. And so if we jump to the next slide, I just want to wrap up by kind of thinking of showcasing some of these benefits. They're really vital habitat benefits here, both for migratory birds, but also for fish and for other species. So that's an important one. Next slide. And then, the Delta is so interesting. One of the strange problems that we have in the Delta is something called ground subsidence. And basically what's happened is this area has these really rich peat soils. And when those soils are exposed to oxygen, which is what's happened over years when these islands were drained and used for agriculture, it oxidizes and the ground actually sinks or subsides. And so what's happened is that in a lot of places in the Delta, there's really profound subsidence where the ground is literally sunk. And that's a major problem for the levees that are supporting islands like Staten Island, especially when we think about the state's water supply. So if we want to ensure that Californians have water security for their clean water, which is really important, we need to make sure those levees are safe. And helping to stop ground subsidence is an important part of that picture. The great thing about converting corn crops to rice is that it actually halts ground subsidence. It doesn't reverse it, but it stops it. And so that's one of the important benefits that we're getting at Staten Island by converting our corn crops to rice. And then additionally, we get some groundwater recharge benefits, which are of course really important in this time of profound drought. And the next slide. And then finally, this point is just so important. I mean, there's infrastructure, obviously, that I mentioned in the Delta, the water infrastructure, there's transportation and energy, but there's people who live in the Delta too. And there are these agricultural communities, and a lot of them are small communities. And when we undertake solutions like what we're doing at Staten, we can help to create benefits that also protect those people. And so I guess just the last slide, I just wanted to kind of come back to this point that when we protect nature, nature protects us. And really, when we talk about nature-based solutions, that's what we're thinking. It's not just about mitigating greenhouse gases or just about quantifying benefits, but sort of thinking holistically about the relationships that our communities have with nature, and knowing that when we implement these solutions in the right way, we get these benefits that do help to protect us and do make sure that we have a future where we can coexist. So I know that was all very fast and lightning. I'm going to stop here, and I'm happy to take questions if there's time, and I can also put some links in the chat.
Great. Thank you very much, Sydney. Excellent presentation. We did have a couple of questions in the chat. It was, but you'll get to those right away. But anybody that has additional questions, please raise your hand. Looks like Devin might have a question. No? Okay. He's up next. Well, one thing I wanted to note, you talked about the co-benefits. And one of the co-benefits I'd heard about the wildlife or the migratory bird project that you're talking about here. And one of the co-benefits of that is, if you look at the patchwork of agriculture that's happened throughout California, that patchwork has limited the migratory bird, the availability of water for the migratory bird population. And by working with the growers, they were able to identify when the birds needed water and make sure that that matched up to the application of water for rice, which I'm not a grower, but that's my understanding. And that was one of the co-benefits outside of the carbon sequestration.
Yeah, Andy, absolutely. And actually, for those of you who are located within sort of driving distance of Northern California or of the Delta, if you go out to Staten in the winter, you'll find just an absolute horde of birds out there. And it's really exciting to see it. I think it's important that we support these populations, right? And they've increasingly lost places where they can stop on the way. And so providing that habitat is really critical.
Okay, with that, Sydney has provided those links that folks asked for in the chat. And I'm going to turn it over now to Devin with the Upper Salinas-Las Tablas Resource Conservation District.
Good afternoon. I'm Devin Best, Executive Director for the Upper Salinas-Las Tablas RCD, Resource Conservation District, and I'm a co-presenter. My counterpart is Michael Larcher with cBrain, who will be presenting after I go through the first couple of slides. And I'm just letting everybody know that he will be joining us. For those of you, one thing I actually want to appreciate that we're doing a Zoom meeting, because it does reduce our carbon footprint, but it is unfortunate because I actually really enjoy when I do presentations, getting to see people's reaction. One of the questions I always like to ask is how many people know what a resource conservation district is, and usually most people don't even know what I'm talking about. Resource conservation districts are nonprofit, non-regulatory. We're here in almost every single county in California, and there's actually a thing called the Soil Water Conservation District in almost every county in the rest of the United States. So Those of us who've never heard of the RCDs, we're actually around. We just spend a lot of time working on the ground doing things. And today I'm going to talk to you about our sustainable land initiative, and everything that Sydney was talking about led right up to this perfect case where one of the big things that we're trying to work on is how do we connect a lot of these sort of larger initiatives with a lot of the farmers that we work with, and particularly farmers, but landowners in general. And we hear a lot of things where farmers want to do things and they're trying to figure out how to navigate all these things and how to make their product or their land resilient. And you hear this kind of buzzword a lot of times, resilient, sustainable, holistic, a lot of different terms. But essentially what we're trying to look at is how can we help them be better at what they're doing, while at the same time helping the environment overall. So today we're going to talk about how Michael and I and a number of other people on the team have this idea and are going forward with it to make how the RCDs are more effective at what we do. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. So Andy, if you wouldn't mind going to the next slide, please. So to give you a frame of reference, my name and the title of my organization is long, but we are here in San Luis Obispo County. I've grew up here. Actually, Michael did as well. It's halfway in between LA and San Francisco, which when we're talking about greenhouse gas reduction, I thought was kind of perfect, because when we're thinking about folks in those areas trying to mitigate for their carbon production, and we're talking about working lands, here's the Central Coast that has a lot of opportunities because we are fairly rural, a lot of agricultural lands and open space, as well as Forest Service lands and whatnot. But we also have a couple of little towns that are punctuated along the way, and not just talking about Santa Barbara, San Luis Obispo City, Paso Robles, Atascadero, a few other places, just so those of you who are watching this have an idea of where we're referencing. And one of the great things that I think about being part of an RCD, and I am kind of tooting my own horn a little bit here, is we are kind of uniquely positioned where we're not a federal entity, we're not a state entity, we're not technically a 501c, and when I say nonprofit, we are actually an unfunded mandate. So we spend all of our time working on grants, mainly to find resources to help landowners with their natural resource concerns. But that also gives us a lot of expertise working with landowners, because we're able to identify a lot of the things that they're wanting to do and try and connect the dots between getting the right permits, getting the right designs, funding, et cetera, et cetera. So it puts us in a really good position working with landowners. They trust us, they rely on us, and they look to us to kind of give them some ideas as things to be looking forward to in the near future. And all this stuff that we're talking about today is a lot of the conversations I've been having with landowners, more focused on what we call the climate impacts. So less about climate change, but really what the impacts they're seeing on their land as far as changes in precipitation patterns, increase in invasive weeds, channel incision that's going on in their local streams, a lot of these things that are starting to occur that they're aware of, but they're trying to figure out how do they get in front of these issues when it's constantly changing in front of them. So if you wouldn't mind going to the next slide. So one of the problems that we have is, as an RCD, and even as probably a collective as a group, is, as I mentioned, we write a lot of grants in order to be able to do a lot of the work that we want to do. That process for us, I think Sydney said it really well, it takes 3 years to get the permits. It takes us almost 3 years to go through the process of meeting with the landowner, writing a grant, waiting several months to get the grant, entering into a contract, developing the designs, then waiting for permits, then getting the work done. And often a lot of times we're left with the, by the time we actually get to the work, it's changed a little bit from the time we first met with the landowner. So we're not really being super quick about addressing their concerns the day that we meet with them as an RCD, and probably a lot of other organizations, because the process itself just takes a long time. It doesn't help also that if we're not doing this quick enough, that if there's some staff turnover or maybe some lag time in the momentum and motivation on the landowner's part, you lose a lot of interest. And so if you're really trying to get people excited about doing something and want to show some real success stories in doing so, we really need to speed up the process in order to really battle against these climate impacts that I just mentioned earlier. So the quicker we as an RCD can do this, the better off we would be. And we know a lot of different funding sources that are available, but we're not able always to line them up perfectly with what a landowner's timeframe is. And so we'll talk a little bit more. Michael will present their company's solution and that help RCDs be more effective at what we do. But I just want to make a point that, again, if I can condense that 3-year time period into a shorter amount of time, one, we're being more responsive to the landowner's needs, but we're also connecting a lot of larger initiatives seamlessly on local grounds. Next slide, please. So working lands, Sydney talked a little bit about that, and I'm looking forward to hearing the last conversation or presentation from Tablas Creek about what they've been able to do. But if you go through kind of an assessment and look at the actual amount of lands that we're looking at and trying to figure out how much carbon we can actually sequester by being effective at meeting the landowner's needs, you can go through and do a couple examples. And here we have some carbon farm plans. It's what you see with the CFP, like the Preston Carbon Farm Plan. And we can actually identify through a number of different models and calculators how much carbon we can sequester by doing certain practices. And from that, it starts kind of becoming relevant. Like carbon sequestration is this sort of nebulous thing that we're not quite sure what that really means. But when you do some conversions and you actually start talking about the number of the amount of carbon you can sequester and how that converts the number of cars. And I think Sydney did a really good job of explaining, like, you could reduce 3 times of the 2019 transportation emissions just by working with working lands. Well, we can go through and the RCD can develop these plans individually for each landowner and say, here's the number of cars you can take off just from your property alone. And so the end goal of this is we're really trying to look at ways to be able to make this so that people understand carbon sequestration is really kind of abstract, but cars on the road, people really get behind. One of the goals that I think Michael and I both have at the end of this is to start being able to convert from carbon sequestration to the amount of water that's retained, because that's going to really make a lot more of an impact with local growers. Carbon, again, is very important. To them, that seems a little bit abstract. You start talking about water, they get much more involved. So with that, if you wouldn't mind going to the next slide, Michael, I believe this is where you and I will sort of hand off the baton and you will start co-presenting. With that being said, again, looking at the RCD's ability to identify environmental projects, we do meet with landowners, and usually in about a 2-hour time period, we identify a number of different things that they want to do, and have a pretty good sense of the types of programs and projects that they could actually implement. So one of the things we want to actually be able to do is take that initial meeting and convert it into actual implementable projects. So Michael, if you're available, why don't you go ahead and take over from here?
Sounds good. So just as a little bit of background, cBrain, we have some pretty strong environmental chops, but our real expertise is as a process company. We help make organizations more efficient, effective, and transparent by designing processes that can be fully digitalized to enable end-to-end execution of whatever you're looking to do. And so what we're looking to do here on the Central Coast, and hopefully far beyond, is to enable resource conservation districts who have significant expertise with the local community to rapidly identify environmentally beneficial projects that are going to ideally reduce greenhouse gas, but also all those other tangential benefits like restoring land or increasing water sequestration, et cetera. How do we take all that local knowledge and actually bring it forward to the execution and the results that we want? So the goal is initially with this pilot with Upper Salinas-Las Tablas Resource Conservation District is to rapidly start building up this inventory of environmental investment opportunities. Projects that are specific to individual landowners that say, here's where we can do repairing and restoration. Here's where we can put compost on land. And how do we start aggregating that over the course of a year in that entire region to say, here are a number of projects that we can start implementing in mass, and here's how we connect those to the right funding sources. But can we go ahead to the next slide, Andy? So as a process company, we start with how does the process currently work? So what I want to do is just walk you across that top row. And so when we first started the project, this is more or less what we realized was happening, is that by happenstance or just good fortune, resource conservation districts would encounter a landowner who was interested in becoming more sustainable. They would start having conversations and back and forth for a couple of weeks and say, it's probably worthwhile for us to come out and do a site visit. So they would then come out and they would develop a plan, and they would make sure it was incredibly scientifically rigorous. And they would build out and then identify all the different opportunities on that land. And then they would actually come together and implement some of those practices based on what the landowner wanted. And depending on what thing that they wanted to implement, it could take 2 months to 12 months. But in between each and every one of those steps, there was typically about a year of wait time. Either there was waiting to find the initial grant to do the initial plan, or there was waiting for a new grant opportunity to open for the window for them even to apply, and then waiting for the decision. When we looked back over the last 3 years, we realized that there were a couple carbon farm plans that had been conducted and developed, and they were very robust, but we couldn't actually say if any carbon had been sequestered. Like, we have to start to accelerate that speed if we want to have the types of impacts we'd like on climate impacts. So we'll go to the next slide, please. So what we did is we've started to create a process that can be conducted fully digitally that will really accelerate our ability to identify projects that are beneficial to the environment. So it'll start actually with intake. So in every opportunity that an RCD has to interact with the landowner, or if a landowner wants to go to the RCD website, they can quickly submit an intake form that says, I have interest in becoming more sustainable. I have interest in, sequestering more water on my land, increasing yields, whatever their motivation is. But they submit enough information in less than 5 minutes that a resource conservation district employee can quickly say, this is worthwhile and we should do additional research with them. It'll then go into the assessment process where, not next slide just yet. They can then assess that landowner using publicly available information, oftentimes using GIS maps or online databases, and then schedule an on-site interview, or so a site visit. During that site visit, RCD members have the expertise to walk around that land and say, here are the 10 different projects that we recommend and the opportunities we see. We want to be able to capture all of that information incredibly quickly and to estimate using Comment Planner what the potential value of that would be. And that allows them to then prioritize those initiatives with the landowner and go through each and every one and say, what is most applicable to you and what do you want to do? Now I'll move on to the next one, please. The goal is to, if you've listened to some of these other webinars, is to create a means for project identification and validation that is incredibly rapid, but also follows scientific principles from start to finish. So that you can start to say, hey, at the end of the year, we've done 15, 20, 30 site visits. And if every landowner had potentially 10 projects on their property, okay, we now have up to 300 environmental projects that are going to reduce greenhouse gas. Oh, and by the way, they also might be very good at preventing wildfires, or at least reducing the chances of wildfires. And they could also help with water sustainability, repair and restoration, or pollinator habitat and conservation. We start to flag each of these different projects based on the benefits that they create. So that if we go to the next slide, we can rapidly tie each and every one of those projects to the appropriate funding source. Now, oftentimes in the past, an RCD might be able to identify these projects and then hand it over to the landowner and say, here's what you could do. Instead, we're trying to keep the RCD involved from start to finish. So they say, and so that they've captured all necessary information during their site visits to say, if you want to move forward with this, here are the 1, 2, or 3 different funding sources that are available that we believe we can actually help you get the money for. If you're okay with it, we have all necessary information. We can move forward with those grant applications immediately, or as soon as the grant window opens. Healthy Soils Program is probably the largest grant out there that we'll be targeting, but we're also looking at SWEEP grants and SGMA grants. And then the one that I think we might be most excited about is actually block grants, because over the course of a few months and over a number of site visits, you can actually aggregate this information and say, we've identified 15 different locations for repair and restoration in San Luis Obispo County. We can go after a block grant in conjunction with the municipality and the county to go after and get funding for all 10 of those, for all 15 of those different projects. So really start to increase the amount of funding coming into the Central Coast for these types of restoration projects. But furthermore, because we are able to account for the potential impact of each and every one of these projects, We have the opportunity to partner with municipalities and counties to say, hey, if you can fund these directly and locally, you could actually use this to help fulfill your climate action plans. Or with SB 1383 coming out, we could also use this to track the county's obligations to get organic material back on working lands. Next slide. We also heard from a lot of landowners that while they may be motivated to become more sustainable, they don't necessarily have the expertise or the equipment to do so. So for example, we heard from one landowner that they only had a pickup truck and they really wanted to start putting compost on their land. Well, if they use their pickup truck, they were going to be doing 20 trips in and out to the compost site to pick up the compost and bring it back. But what's more, they don't have a compost spreader and they can't afford to buy a compost spreader to get access to this. So how do we actually connect what's available within the local economy to help the landlords actually do this? And so doing, we're going to keep the RCD members involved every step of the way so that they can help identify who has a compost spreader that might be available for that. What would be the cost of leasing that? And or could that be provided as a service offered by the county or another agency within the region? And then also, here are some partners that can help us with these different things. But the long-term goal is to really start to reduce the cost of implementation, improve the quality, and then also, because the RCDs are involved from start to finish, it provides a consistent form of monitoring by a validated third party to kind of walk it all the way through. This is also where we're going to put out a kind of a selfless ask here, that if you are interested in partnering or working to help with implementation or with funding, please ping Devin or me offline afterwards, and our emails at the end. But we'd really like to work with others to help bring this to fruition. It really requires us all working together in a local community. And then the next slide. The immediate result is that by the end of this first year, and this as we're going through the pilot, is that we'd like resource conservation districts to be able to provide verification that's going to satisfy any number of different statewide grants, but also climate action plans and SB 1383. Now, slightly more aspirational, and what we're hoping to do in the upcoming years is that we're hoping that this could be something that is used to meet CEQA offsets and saying, here's how much carbon was actually sequestered over the course of these projects. Could this be used for offsets? And or could this feed into carbon markets as well? Next slide, please. Our goal in this first year is to actually conduct execute this process with 15 different landowners. So that means building out 15 different resource conservation plans. And if our back of the envelope math holds up, that's almost the equivalent of about 9,000 vehicles. Now that might not be huge from a statewide perspective, but that's 1/4 of the vehicles in the largest city in San Luis Obispo County. So it is quite impactful and quite quick. But where we get most excited is, if you go to the next slide, please, is that this is something that can scale quickly. We've built this process to be robust enough and standard enough that it can be used by RCDs across the state. And so if we start scaling this initially through the Central Coast, and it's using it for an entire year instead of half a year, we have the potential to really be impactful. And there are, just for context, there are, I believe, 96 resource conservation districts across the state of California. And this is also something that's just as applicable across the nation. So I think you can go ahead to the last slide and we'll open up for questions.
That's a great presentation. Thank you very much, Devin and Michael. Don't have any questions so far in the chat. If anybody has some specific questions that you'd like to ask, you can raise your hand right now and we can have those answered. And while we're waiting, Michael and Devin, you were talking about CEQA mitigation. From our air district's perspective, we do see a lot of projects that come through that are large in scale that need emission reductions. They don't necessarily have to go through the offset methods or offsets to secure those reductions. We're really actually looking to try to find projects locally here. And this sounds like a really good opportunity to source those for CEQA mitigation.
Yeah, I saw a question that came up about urban landscapes, and I'll come back to it, but this then kind of tie in with what you just said, Andy. We already, before we even actually have this pilot project launched, we identified a landowner that has about 1,400 acres, and at the initial starting point is 640 acres they would like to apply compost on, and that was done literally within like a 4-hour meeting. Just for context for everybody, that normally would take us about a year probably of going through and developing the plans and contracts and everything else. So already we can see the results of condensing that down just in a short amount of time, but then also identifying separately initiatives here locally where we might be able to get that compost funded and delivered for the landowner, where it could be almost at no cost to them.
That's great. We do have one question. It's from Sharon Merritt, and I'm going to open her up to be able to speak. Go ahead, Sharon. Sharon, I think you need to unmute yourself, it looks like.
Got it. Thank you. FSA, I understand, in addition to RCDs, also helps put together grant applications for ecological projects on farms. And my understanding is that the main sources of money are Healthy Soils, SWEEP, and EQIP. Are there other, and I'm wondering what % of the cost do the grants cover? And if there's others besides Healthy Soils, SWEEP, and EQIP?
Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, so Farm Service Agency, FSA, and NRCS, Natural Resource Conservation Service, they also have their farm bill programs. So there are opportunities to do cost share through those grant opportunities. So what we're presenting is all those funding sources can be applied to any particular practice. When you talk about the Healthy Soils or the SWEEP, sometimes there's a cost share component that goes with that. My goal as an executive director of an RCD is to try and provide as much funding as possible to landowners who are interested in doing things. So again, the backstory of this would be if that landowner I just mentioned that's getting 640 acres of compost, they wouldn't necessarily have to know where all the different funding sources are coming from. That would be our role. And with this particular pilot project, that helps us identify where those sources are coming and be able to track those as they're going forward. So in the end, ideally, the end result would just be a contract with the RCD, and the RCD is responsible for getting all those funding sources provided to them.
And how much of those are cost share when you're funding or when you're finding the funding sources? And what percentage is the cost share?
It all depends on the grant agency, and I'm not trying to skirt around the question. It's just sometimes they're 25%, sometimes 10%, sometimes 50%. So with each one of them, sometimes it can get down to 0, but that's just dependent on the grant agency. So if we're capable of matching different funding pools to provide that cost share that they are requiring, and I do this all the time with other projects where I may have 2 granting agencies that we're applying to and are awarded. Let's say they need 25% cost share, and you say, well, one's a federal, one's a state, and they say that's great. You've provided 100% cost to the landowner themselves. The landowner never knows about the cost share component. That's really more for us to track through our grant requirements and reporting.
And what's the difference between working through the FSA and the RCD?
The FSA is a federal entity, and and so they have a whole process of applying for their contracts through the Farm Bill. The RCDs are nonprofit special district. So we're more local. We cover more of a county-wide or even smaller district area. We're just backstory, NRCS FSA were born kind of out of the Dust Bowl era, and having a federal entity come out to your property and say, I'm here to help, didn't go over very well. So they developed soil water conservation district with local representatives to kind of address local resources and concerns. And so the RCD is just another kind of component of the soil water conservation districts where again, we have that more local interest and connection.
Great
Okay,
question,
thank you.
Sharon. Thank you. And Devin, we do have one other question in the chat, but we do need to move on to our next presentation. So I'm going to go ahead and start sharing. Actually, we don't have a presentation from Jordan, so I'm going to go ahead and just introduce Jordan. He's a viticulturist with Tablas Creek Vineyard. So Jordan, go ahead and take it away. Did we lose Jordan? Hey, Clay, do you think, I don't see Jordan on the screen here. Is he in the attendees?
He may have logged out and logged back in. I see someone with their hand raised that has my name, which means they use my link to get in. So just
Okay.
hang tight for a moment. We'll see if we can't get him. There we go. That was him.
All right.
Sorry about that, folks. Yeah, Jordan Lonborg, viticulturist at Tablas Creek Vineyard. We are located on the west side of Paso. It's a 280 acre property. 135 acres are planted. And we have about 145 acres of oak woodlands and grasslands surrounding the property. Tablas Creek was started as a passion project between, I'm sorry, my camera's all messed up here. It was started as a passion project with the Perrin family and Bob Haas, who started Vineyard Brands in the early 1960s. They were the first fine wine importer into the United States. And he had met up with the Perrins in his travels. Perrins were located in the Southern Rhone. They owned Bocastel Winery at the time, and they had this long, fruitful relationship in the industry. In the early 80s, they decided to start a passion project somewhere in the United States. They were traveling around in Washington, Oregon, Napa area, looking for limestone soils. And they kept hearing about Paso Robles. So they got in the car. This is like 1981, 82. Drove down to Paso Robles. At the time, all the grapes are being grown on the east side of the 101, which is very flat and sandy, and they all pull off of the same water basin. They headed west off the 101 into the hills, and they were coming around down this road by the name of Willow Creek, and they came around this cut bank, and the whole face of the cut bank was white limestone. They all looked at each other, light bulbs went off, and yeah, they purchased Tablas Creek's property, and they started importing Rhone varietals from the Bocastel property in the Southern Rhone. It was their goal at the time to spread Rhone varietals throughout the United States. At that time, the only Rhones that were being grown in the United States were mostly suitcase clones. So nothing that had gone through quarantine. Built a nursery at Tablas Creek, started importing the cuttings from France. They hired a winemaker by the name of Neil Collins, who is our current winemaker. He's been with the company for close to 30 years now. They sent Neil to France to learn the Perrin style of winemaking. And it was there Neil encountered organics for the first time. And knowing that he was going to be living at Tablas Creek with his wife and 2 young kids, he wasn't entirely comfortable with the use of conventional or chemical products. So when he moved back from France, they stopped using all chemical fertilizers and pesticides and switched to organics. This is around the year 1999. In 2003, the property was certified organic. In 2010, first sheep showed up on the property, and they started dabbling with biodynamics. In 2016, we certified the entire vineyard biodynamic. And at that time, the herd was at around 10 sheep in 2010. We were at around 80 in 2016. And in 2017 is when we really started blowing up the sheep program. We went from 80 sheep to 160, and that progressed. We've discovered that our holding capacity for 12 months out of the year is at around 120 sheep. But in the grazing months within the vineyard, we lamb at a time when we can kind of double the herd. So we'll have around 300 sheep, which is what you see behind me. That's a max capacity herd for the vineyard. Biodynamics and regenerative farming. So biodynamics was started by a guy, his name was Rudolf Steiner. He was a agronomist, a German agronomist, grew up in an agricultural community filled with small farms, lots of life. Animals were incorporated to every system, lots of biodiversity. It was around this time, it was the advent of chemical insecticides and fertilizers, and he quickly started seeing these small farms become larger farms, conglomerated, and the life started disappearing. The soils started dying. Biodiversity was non-existent. There were these mass monoculture type systems, and the inputs kept increasing on these farms. So he developed biodynamics, and it's, simply put, an on-farm mentality, closed loop system, a biodiverse system. And there are some parts of biodynamics that include, planting on a lunar calendar, harvesting on a lunar calendar. There are some sprays that are involved where you're using silica quartz crystals in your spray regimen to stimulate photosynthesis at certain times of the year, or you're using cow horn manures in the winter months, incorporated into a spray to stimulate microbial activity in your soil. For us at Tablas Creek, the spiritual side of biodynamics is very hard for us to wrap our heads around. We definitely abide by the guidelines, but the parts of biodynamics that we really latch onto are, the closed loop mentality, the biodiverse mentality, the on-farm mentality. In 2018, end of the year 2018, we were approached by the ROA, Regenerative Organic Alliance, to become a part of their pilot program, which was the Regenerative Organic Certification. And at the time, for me, I saw that certification hit our desk. I wasn't too fired up about it. Another certification meant more paperwork, more time at the desk, less time in the field. But as I started to read through the guidelines and the pillars, which there are 3, it became apparent quite quickly that it was something that we needed to get behind and be a part of. It was and unlike any other certification that I've encountered in my years working in agriculture, it focuses on soil health, animal welfare, and lastly, and most importantly, really for us, was the social welfare aspect. You know, there's no other certification that I had seen that pays as close attention to how you treat the people that work on that farm and on that property. And it took us down this road of regenerative farming. I mean, to be completely honest with all of you, if you had asked me what regenerative farming was in 2018, I would not have been able to give you an answer. It was a completely new term to me. Come to find out, regenerative farming follows biodynamics almost to a T, leaving aside the spiritual aspect of biodynamics. So, and it's been an amazing journey. You know, we went from looking at our property as a 135-acre vineyard to a 280-acre system. Every inch of that property became a part of the farm. With the sheep, so with regeneratives, our practices, the sheep are the core of our program. They're the core of our fertility program. When you talk about the closed loop mentality, you know, you need to think of options to create a fertile soil. Cover crops will help with that. That's something that we do heavily on the property, you know, incorporating nitrogen fixers, legumes, vetches, whatnot. But that can only get you so far. The sheep herd, it's mind-blowing what they have done for that property since we really increased the herd size. You know, 300 sheep were able to graze every inch of that vineyard 3 times a year, depending on rainfall. And we have watched blocks that typically were exhibiting signs and symptoms of various viruses, leaf rolls, and red blotch. You know, these blocks would be shutting down in August, you know, seeing red leaves come on and canopy shutting down. Those same blocks 3 years later are holding a green canopy, you know, right through harvest. Now, when we're done with those sheep, because of regenerative farming and this philosophy of, you know, this whole on-farm mentality, we've started an agroforestry project. So we're going through all of our oak woodlands. We're removing dead trees, removing dead fall, and cleaning up some of the bases of the existing oaks. And we're allowing sunlight to hit that ground again. And, you know, the benefits are threefold. We are promoting the regrowth of all this native vegetation, perennial grasses. We are gaining back acreage for feed, so it allows us to keep a larger herd in the winter and the summer months. And then we're taking a lot of that woody material, and we're bringing it out of the vineyard, and we're biocharing it. So biochar is a practice we've started toying around with. I wish I could pull up my pictures. I can't figure out my computer right now. I'm a farmer, not a computer guy. Sorry, people. But we've developed a couple methods, not developed, but research a couple methods. We burn in a pit in the ground. We use a top up method. So we'll start a small fire on top of whatever woody material we're trying to biochar. And we let that fire burn all the way to the bottom. And what you see when you start these burn piles on top of this woody material is it's a smokeless fire. The gases that are being released from all that woody material don't have a chance to make it into our atmosphere. So all that particulate matter, all those gases combust in the fire. Once we feel like that fire has reached the bottom of the pit, we'll cover the pit up and we let it extinguish itself. That had some limiting factors. It takes a long time for those coals to go out. And you are limited by the size of your pit and you have to wait. There's a lot of time in between. We also took a 1,000-gallon wine tank. We cut the top off of it, slightly concaved at the top. So it allows the smoke to roll back into the kiln itself and start a small fire at the bottom, and we'll slowly add material as you see an ash layer form. And it allows you, by burning in the tank, it allows you to extinguish that fire pretty quickly with a hose. We can fill the tank up and then drain it at the bottom. That biochar gets all reincorporated back into our compost pile. So, part of that closed loop mentality was, what are some of the inputs that we can stop bringing on site from off site? We stopped importing all fertilizers. We stopped importing compost. We now create all of our own compost using chipped canes or chipped woody material that we're bringing out of the understory. That's our carbon source for the compost pile itself, and then the nitrogen source all comes out of the winery. So we're using grape skins and rachis and whatnot. So it's this beautiful process. Everything is reused. Everything that comes out of the winery is reused. Part of that closed loop system is solar power. The winery, the property, we're 100% off the grid at this point. So we do pump it back into the grid certain times of the year. We recapture all of our gray water out of the winery into a two-tier pond system. So the water travels down the side of the building. It gets pumped into a pond that is filled with aquatic plant species, and they filter out all the anything we don't want in there, and that gets pumped into a holding pond. And we have the capability to pump out of that holding pond and into a water truck. We'll use that water to add moisture to our compost pile, or we'll add moisture to the precursors. So all of the carbon that we're collecting throughout the year, we kind of kick off the composting process before we're actually introducing nitrogen. It's a special place. I mean, you walk onto this property and you hear the life in the vineyard. You hear the birds. You see insects everywhere you look. The biodiversity we're trying to increase at every corner. So 35% of the vineyard, almost 40% of the vineyard is dry farmed. When a vine dies in their dry farm settings, we plant fruit trees. We have olive trees planted throughout the property. They're not in any particular block, so to speak. You'll see fruit trees planted sporadically throughout the property as well. We've started establishing perennial native beneficial gardens. So, at a time, maybe 5 or 6 years ago, we were spending money on ripping toyon and coyote bush out of the vineyard. Now we're planting it. Lavenders, rosemaries, anything that will hold a flower for a long period of time. in the vineyard. So really just doing whatever we can, wherever we can, to promote biodiversity, being as far from a monoculture as possible, reducing the amount of tractor passes wherever we can. It's less about aesthetics to us now. To us, a shaggy vineyard is aesthetically pleasing. I see vineyards that are just grapes and they're perfect and manicured. To me now, that's a red flag. I want to see lots of grasses and lots of perennials growing throughout the property. So it's been amazing journey. We're watching the landscape change in our oak woodlands. We're seeing plants come up that probably haven't grown in the number that they're growing. Rye grasses, bunch grasses, a lot of these beautiful perennial flowers that, Neil has never seen on the property, and he lived there for 25 years. Being able to look through these understories now and seeing grasses come up, and we're getting, because of that moisture retention, we're getting a couple passes for grazing. What you see behind me there, that's our sheep herd. We use a mob grazing tactic when we're running these animals throughout the property, and the concept there is to maximize the amount of feed that the animals are eating, and maximizing the amount of manure that goes down on the ground. So you give them enough space to where they have enough feed for about a day, maybe 2 days. They competitively feed with each other. So if you give a herd too much ground, they're going to selectively graze, selectively eat the plants that they want. By condensing that herd, they become competitive. So they're going to eat that plant because they don't want the sheep next to them eating. This process takes place. So we'll build a paddock with a paddock right next to it. It's electric movable fence, and the sheep are constantly moved. So that reduces the amount of compaction that is performed, increases the amount of manure that goes down on the ground, manure and urine, and really increases the fertility of the soil. It's been amazing to watch. I've gotten in the habit of, how do I pull up these pictures? Whatever. Sorry about that. Well, I've gotten in the habit. I've gotten in the habit of taking a shovel around with me in the last month or two of the rainy season, and you're hard pressed to put that shovel in the ground, lift it up, and not see earthworm activity. That's been a really fun development to be a part of. Yeah. So what else do we got here? Yeah,
Well, Jordan.
Yeah.
Yeah. So you are providing some really amazing facts as to what's happening there on the ground there at Tablas Creek. Can I just go through a couple of things I heard and just hear some more of your thoughts on those things? I'm hearing things like you're seeing improved native vegetation. You're seeing increase in biodiversity, improvements in soil health. You're doing no-till, which means less diesel. You need less tractors because of that. You're not fertilizing. You don't need compost any longer. So all these inputs that you used to have, the costs are gone because you're not needing it with these new practices. I'm thinking I also heard that you are not doing herbicides as well, maybe as well. There's no pesticides. And I think what I'm hearing is you've got improved soil health. You've got improved soil microbiology, better cation exchange capacity, more pollinators, better water holding capacity, and improvements in fertility and the vine's health and production. So all of these things from regenerative and biodynamic processes are ultimately sequestering carbon. So we just have a few more minutes here. I'd like to hear some of your thoughts on some of those closing things that I heard.
Yeah, I mean, we definitely don't use herbicides. There are plenty of implements available now for farmers to avoid that process altogether. When it does rain and we reach capacity, you see water running off, and it's clear. There's no silt involved whatsoever. The quality of the wine, I think, since 2018 has definitely improved. It was great to begin with, but it's the last couple of vintages have just been stellar. And we're constantly, the one thing we're dogmatic about is not being dogmatic. So we're constantly trying to be better as far as our practices are concerned. That's probably our biggest carbon footprint. We do dry farm. Dry farming does take a lot of tractor passes. There's no question about that. But our eyes are all over the electric equipment that's coming out now. The UTVs on the property we're converting to electric. ATVs, electric. It's all part of that process. Yeah.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Jordan. And I want to thank Sydney, Devin, and Michael as well. What I've heard today is, Sydney, you identified a bunch of 13 new strategies or strategies that are implementable here in California today. We're hearing of the RCD that is looking for their landowners to identify projects that they want to implement today if there's grant funding available. And Jordan is showing us the practices that will end up being some of the practices that are implemented there at the RCD and throughout the state through those programs that Sydney was talking about. So that's I think a bit of a wrap. Does any of the speakers have some final thoughts that they'd like to share? We do have one question that has come in for Jordan, and that is, can you comment on the introduction of species that will attract and maintain bee health in land management?
Yeah. There are a lot of, you can look towards, I'm not sure where you live, but in California, there is the CAFF, CAFF. They have an amazing book on certain plants you can bring onto your property depending on the region that you live in. So for us, it's a lot of these native species. Toyon is a huge one. Coyote bush is a huge one. Ceanothus is another major attractor to beneficial insects. It's also based on color scheme. So everything I have read, if you can incorporate plants that have a purple flower, a white flower, and a yellow flower and use those plants in combination, that's something that really attracts insects. As a concept, it's a bicycle wheel concept where, if you look down at the top of a bicycle wheel, you have a hub, and from that hub, you have your spokes. So in the center of your farm, that's where your perennial, that's your hub. That's where your beneficial habitat should exist. From there, you can start planting your spokes, giving those insects pathways to move into the vineyard. All of those plants are huge for bee life, honeybees as well.
Great. Okay. We are just about at time. Devin and Michael, I saw you brought your cameras on. Did you have any last comments that you wanted to share?
I was just gonna say, Jordan, thank you. Love the wine, but also love what you guys are doing from a sustainability perspective on the land. Really, the goal of what Devin and I are working on is to make more landowners like you guys. So thank you.
Thank you. Come on up, man. Come on up for a tour, Mike.
My ongoing joke is Tablas Creek is always a half a step ahead of where I want to be with other landowners. So I always look to you guys for examples of what we want to be doing. So that image in the background, I hope to see more of in SLO County.
And I'd say the scaling that we were talking about, both through Sydney's discussion and with the RCD, what we're seeing there at the Tablas Creek Vineyard, if that could get scaled throughout the state, we can hit those numbers that Sydney was talking about, 3 times the vehicles. And, you know, Sydney's map is showing just some of the strategies that Jordan's talking about, but there's a lot of other strategies that are available for being implemented right now. Okay, with that, I think we'll close it down. And I just want to remind everybody that next week we have our 5th in the series. It's our final session is going to be, our participants are going to be going into breakout groups or rooms to collaborate on various local carbon sequestration projects to try to develop and identify and how you might fund and implement those projects, and then workshop that and then come back out and discuss that with the group. So we really appreciate your attention today, and we will see you next week. Thank you.